A single clue, a vanished treasure, and a murder that defies reason. Welcome to the Via File. I am your host, Victor Harlow. This community is growing fast. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Your voices make every mystery come alive. Let's begin. The Dolphin Theatre stood in Wharfinger Lane like a Georgian dowager who had submitted to an expensive and thoroughly successful rejuvenation. Her honey-coloured stone facade glowed under restored gas lamps, while the original wrought-iron balconets cast delicate shadows across windows that sparkled with fresh gilt. Inside, crimson velvet seats had been reupholstered to their former glory. Plasterwork cherubs smiled from freshly painted heights, and the air carried the mingled sense of lavender polish, old canvas, and the faint sweetness of new timber. It was opening night, and London's theatrical society had gathered in numbers that spoke both to curiosity about the restoration and to the considerable social influence of the man whose wealth had made this resurrection possible. Inspector Roderick Alleyn moved through the ornate foyer with unhurried grace, his wife Troy having been swept away by Lady Brackenridge's enthusiastic commentary on architectural details. The gathering possessed that particular quality of restrained anticipation that characterized such occasions among the educated classes. Voices carefully modulated, laughter never quite spontaneous, and beneath it all the electric awareness that reputations might be made or unmade before the final curtain fell. Jeremy Destry held court near the restored marble fireplace, accepting congratulations with measured grace. He was perhaps 60, with silver hair that caught the light and features that suggested both intelligence and an appreciation for finer things. His evening dress was impeccable, his manner warmly attentive. Yet Alleyn noted how his eyes moved constantly across the gathering, cataloguing and assessing with the methodical precision of a collector examining potential acquisitions. Inspector Alleyn, what an unexpected pleasure. Destry's voice carried cultured tones that suggested someone who had learned to speak beautifully rather than being born to it. I confess I had hoped this evening would pass without requiring the services of Scotland Yard, even socially. One trusts it shall, Mr. Destry. Though I find theatres fascinating places, so much depends upon everyone playing their appointed role with absolute precision. A flicker of amusement passed across Destry's features. Indeed, though I've discovered that the most interesting dramas often occur in the wings rather than upon the stage itself. Their conversation was interrupted by Peregrine J., the young director, whose artistic vision had guided the evening's production. He moved with barely contained creative energy, his evening clothes worn with the slight awkwardness of someone more comfortable in rehearsal attire. Mr. Destry, I wanted to thank you once more. My dear fellow, no thanks are necessary. Art must have its patrons, and patrons must have their pleasures. Destry's smile was benevolent, yet Alleyn detected an undertone that somehow diminished the younger man's gratitude. I trust everything is in readiness backstage. Absolutely. Miranda is in splendid form, and Marcus is giving what I believe will be the performance of his career. One hopes so. At his age, such opportunities become increasingly precious. The casual cruelty of the remark hung briefly in the air before Jay's professional composure reasserted itself, and he excused himself. Alleyn observed the brief tightening around Destry's eyes that suggested satisfaction at having delivered a precisely calculated wound. As if summoned by their conversation, Miranda Troy made her entrance, drawing a collective intake of breath. Her beauty was undeniable, yet Alleyn noted the intelligent, almost calculating glint in her eyes as she surveyed the room. Her exchange with Destry was a ballet of polished courtesies, each word carefully chosen. Marcus Knight appeared moments later, his need for this role evident in every carefully controlled gesture. He laughed slightly too loudly at Destry's pleasantries, his eyes seeking affirmation with an eagerness that spoke of desperation barely held in check. Alleyn observed the faint lines of strain around the older actor's mouth, the way his shoulders seemed to carry an invisible burden. In the shadows near a velvet curtain stood Condutis, Destry's mysterious business partner. His continental manners were impeccable, yet his watchful intensity could not be disguised. He observed with unnerving stillness, occasionally exchanging wordless glances with Destry that seemed weighted with unspoken understanding. The warning bell chimed softly, and the gathering began its elegant migration toward the auditorium. Alleyn watched Destry accept the deference of his guests, noting how conversations paused when he approached and resumed in subtly altered tones after he passed. There was something in the man's manner that suggested he derived genuine pleasure from such displays of influence, the refined appreciation of someone who understood power as an art form. As they took their seats, and the curtain began its majestic rise, Alleyn found himself wondering about the true cost of the Dolphin's restoration, and whether that price had been measured solely in pounds sterling. The stage beckoned with its promise of illusion, yet something in the very air suggested that this carefully orchestrated evening might yet strike a note far darker than any the playwright had intended. The first act concluded to applause that rippled through the restored auditorium, with the measured enthusiasm appropriate to such occasions. The Georgian salon adjacent to the foyer received the emerging audience like a drawing room prepared for distinguished guests. Pale green walls adorned with theatrical portraits caught the warm light of crystal chandeliers, while arrangements of white roses and trailing ivy provided elegant counterpoints to the room's classical proportions. The air carried the mingled scents of champagne, lavender polish, and that indefinable perfume of cultured gathering, voices carefully modulated, laughter never quite spontaneous, and beneath it all the electric awareness that artistic reputations hung in the balance. Inspector Alleyn found himself momentarily separated from Troy in the gentle crush of evening, dress and animated conversation. He observed the ritualized dance of interval society. Critics whispered preliminary verdicts with the gravity of judges, dowagers held court with imperious fans, and younger members of the company moved with that particular nervous energy that marks those whose careers depend upon such evenings. The gathering possessed all the polished surface of successful cultural occasions, yet Alleyn detected undercurrents that seemed to eddy around certain individuals like invisible stage lighting. Jeremy Destry moved through his guests with practiced grace, accepting compliments on both the production and the theatre's restoration with measured pleasure. His evening clothes were impeccable, his manner warmly attentive, yet Alleyn noted a certain breathlessness in his responses, as if the social performance required more effort than usual. When Lady Brackenridge inquired solicitously about his health, Destry's smile carried a slight strain. "I fear the excitement of the evening has rather overwhelmed me," he admitted with characteristic understatement. "Perhaps a few moments of quiet reflection would serve me well." "Nonsense, my dear fellow," boomed Sir Dougal MacBride, whose theatrical reviews could make or destroy careers. "This is your triumph as much as anyone's. You mustn't disappear at the very moment of victory." Destry's response remained courteous, yet Alleyn observed the brief tightening around his eyes that suggested genuine discomfort. "You're most kind, Sir Dougal, but I believe I shall retreat to my box for the remainder of the interval. The view from there allows one to appreciate the full scope of our restoration, and I confess to feeling rather proprietorial about the entire enterprise." Peregrine J. approached with barely concealed anxiety, his champagne glass untouched in his hands. "Mr. Destry, is everything quite all right? You seem rather pale." "Merely the natural nervousness of opening night, dear boy. I shall be perfectly restored by the second act, I assure you." Destry's tone carried that particular quality of dismissal that the well-bred employed to indicate that concern, however kindly meant, was unwelcome. Miranda Troy glided past in silver silk, her conversation with Marcus Knight punctuated by glances toward their departing patron. Alleyn noted how both actors' eyes followed Destry's progress toward the private staircase, their expressions carefully neutral, yet somehow watchful. Knight's laugh at something Miranda had said seemed slightly forced, while her smile possessed a calculation that suggested divided attention. The warning bell chimed softly through the salon, and the gathering began its return to the auditorium with measured precision. Alleyn took his seat beside Troy, who murmured appreciation for the production's quality, while her artist's eye continued cataloguing architectural details. The house lights dimmed with theatrical ceremony, and the curtain began its stately ascent. Yet as the second act commenced, Destry's box remained conspicuously empty, its ornate chair casting an ominous shadow in the reflected stage lights. The performance proceeded with professional excellence, but other members of the audience had begun to notice as well subtle shifts in posture, whispered exchanges quickly suppressed, glances that lingered on the vacant chair with growing unease. It was Mrs. Lazenby, the theatre's meticulous house manager, who first took action. Her concern, initially mild, escalated as the minutes passed without sign of the theatre's patron. Moving with practiced discretion, she slipped away from her post and made her way to the private box via the narrow service stair that connected to Destry's reserved domain. Her gentle tap at the box door received no response. "Mr. Destry?" she called softly, then with growing alarm. "Sir?" The man in the velvet chair sat very upright, like a distinguished guest prepared to endure a lengthy speech, but his head had fallen forward at an angle that the living seldom achieve. Mrs. Lazenby's trained composure faltered as she turned to find Alleyn, who had followed her quiet summons, standing in the doorway. He entered at once, closing the door behind him, and moved to examine the scene with professional attention. There was a faint odor in the confined space that did not belong to beeswax or velvet. Delicate at first breath, then somehow repellent. Alleyn noted the way Destry's hands lay, crossed with unnatural precision, and the curious arrangement of objects on the small marquetry table beside his chair, a cut-glass carafe, half filled with water, a slim silver flask with its cap precisely closed, and a pair of pale gloves placed with mathematical exactness parallel to the table's edge. A handkerchief had fallen nearby, bearing a minute smudge of color that might have been grease paint or cosmetic residue. When Alleyn lifted the victim's eyelids, the shadowed brightness beneath confirmed what his trained instincts had already recognized. He straightened, looked once more at the too perfect arrangement of personal effects, and turned to Mrs. Lazenby, who waited with the controlled alarm of one accustomed to theatrical crises. "Mrs. Lazenby, if you would be so kind as to summon the company's medical man, if there is one, and ask Mr. J to join us quietly. We must not alarm the house." He paused, considering the service door that led to the narrow stair. "Has anyone passed this way since the interval?" Her keys chimed faintly as she found her professional voice. "No one to my knowledge, sir. Mr. Destry preferred his privacy. Mr. Kondukis sometimes uses this stair, but not this evening." From the stage came the sound of applause as the scene concluded, absurdly normal against the silence that had settled over the box. Alleyn examined the silver flask without touching it, noting the faint crescent of powder on its cap, as if pressed by a careful thumb. The sound of the performance continued below, a reminder that illusion must be maintained even as reality intruded with its darker truths. He did not yet speak the word murder aloud, but his methodical examination of the scene, the precise positioning of objects, the faint chemical odor, the victim's unnatural posture, told its own story. In this temple of theatrical artifice, someone had staged a performance far more deadly than any scripted drama, and the Dolphin's restoration had begun with a silence more profound than any applause. The Dolphin Theatre had settled into that peculiar stillness known only to buildings that have unexpectedly become repositories of private catastrophe. The Georgian Salon, which an hour before had buzzed with the refined energy of cultured gathering, now bore witness to a different kind of performance entirely. Detective Inspector Fox arrived with the measured efficiency that marked Scotland Yard's finest, his presence somehow both unobtrusive and absolutely authoritative. He removed his hat with a slight inclination to Mrs. Lazenby and moved through the ornate space as one might enter a church before matins, conscious of disturbing something sacred yet determined in his purpose. Alleyn had ensured that the transition from cultural evening to criminal investigation occurred with remarkable discretion. The audience had been dismissed with expressions of regret over Mr. Destry's sudden indisposition, while the principal members of the company remained for what was delicately termed assistance with inquiries. The very phrasing carried that particular British genius for making the extraordinary seem merely administrative. Yet no one present could mistake the gravity of circumstances that had transformed their artistic triumph into something far more sinister. In the private box where Destry's body still reposed, awaiting the medical examiner's attention, Fox observed the scene with professional thoroughness. The faint sweet odor that Alleyn had noted earlier seemed more pronounced now, a curious counterpoint to the theatre's usual blend of beeswax and old velvet. The small marquetry table bore its careful arrangement of objects: the cut-glass carafe, the silver flask with its precisely closed cap, the pale gloves positioned with mathematical exactness. "Nasty business, sir," Fox murmured, his voice carrying that quality of understated concern that marked his long partnership with Alleyn. "Looks peaceful enough at first glance, but there's something not quite natural about the whole arrangement. Indeed. Fox, note the positioning of the hands and that faint chemical scent which seems quite out of place in a theatre box. The flask's cap bears a minute crescent where powder has taken a print, and there's a curious smudge on this handkerchief, warmer than pearl, cooler than flesh, with the character of grease paint prepared for stage lighting." Their initial interviews commenced in the theatre's green room, recently reupholstered with admirable restraint. An oak table bore a brown teapot and china that attempted cheerfulness with a border of cornflowers, while theatrical portraits observed the proceedings with knowing eyes. Peregrine J. arrived first, his evening dress slightly disarranged by the shock of events, his usual directorial composure replaced by the rapid attentiveness of someone confronted by an unexpected and unwelcome rehearsal. "Mr. J," Alleyn said pleasantly, settling into his chair with unhurried grace, "I'm afraid we must take up some of your time, though we shall endeavour to be as brief as possible." "Anything, Inspector. I am entirely at your disposal." Jay's voice carried the careful articulation of someone choosing words with unusual precision. When invited to describe his relationship with the deceased, his response revealed subtle undercurrents beneath professional gratitude. Mr. Destry was naturally the theatre's principal patron. Without his generosity, the Dolphin would have remained a ruin. He took considerable interest in our artistic decisions, perhaps more than some would consider strictly necessary. Yet you valued his support? One values what one requires for survival, Inspector. Whether one finds such dependence entirely comfortable is perhaps a different matter. The admission carried a note of artistic frustration carefully controlled, and Alleyn observed how Jay's hands opened and closed as he spoke of Destry's decided opinions and his reluctance to keep them private. Miranda Troy entered with the controlled grace that marked her profession, her silver evening dress catching the light as she moved to the indicated chair. Her beauty remained undeniable, yet Alleyn noted how her eyes avoided direct contact when the conversation turned to her patron's character. Her account of their professional relationship was delivered with the precision of well-rehearsed lines, each word carefully chosen to convey respect without warmth. "Mr. Destry was most generous in his support of the theatre," she said, her voice carrying that particular quality of controlled emotion that suggested depths carefully concealed. "His enthusiasm was sometimes rather overwhelming, but his dedication to artistic excellence was unquestionable. Marcus Knight's entrance revealed the full extent of emotional strain that stage makeup had earlier disguised. His distinguished features showed lines of exhaustion, and his usually commanding presence seemed somehow diminished. His distress appeared genuine, yet whether from grief or fear of professional ruin remained unclear to Alleyn's trained observation. "This is catastrophic," Knight said, his resonant voice carrying undertones of desperation. The production, the theatre's future, everything depended upon his continued support. At my age, such opportunities become increasingly precious. Dr. Curtis, the police surgeon, arrived with his small case and the professional reserve that served as sanctuary in the presence of high feeling. His preliminary examination confirmed Alleyn's suspicions. Traces of an exotic poison, a compound historically used in theatrical circles for dramatic effects, yet lethal in concentrated doses. The substance required both specialized knowledge and careful preparation, pointing toward someone with intimate familiarity with theatrical traditions. As the interviews concluded, Alleyn made one final discovery. In the narrow corridor leading to the private stair, a common theatre pin had been thrust into the spring of the latch, preventing the door from fully engaging. He drew it out and held it upon his palm, a small thing that spoke volumes about premeditation and intimate knowledge of the theatre's hidden geography. The Dolphin Theatre, with its restored beauty and cultural pretensions, had become a stage for human drama, far more complex than any scripted performance. Somewhere among these polished professionals walked a killer who had used the very refinement of their shared world to commit murder most carefully planned. The morning light filtered through the Dolphin Theatre's tall windows with that peculiar quality of illumination that follows upon sleepless nights and unwelcome revelations. The green room, which had served as sanctuary for countless performers over the decades, now bore the accumulated weight of secrets partially revealed and truths carefully guarded. Its pale walls, newly distempered, caught the wan sunlight with a subdued gleam, while the old carpet, though beaten and revived, still retained that faint scent of dust and camphor that spoke of theatrical history. A silver tea service had been arranged upon the oak table with meticulous attention to propriety, the delicate china somehow incongruous against the backdrop of criminal investigation. Inspector Alleyn had spent the early hours examining the theatre's financial records, documents that revealed a picture considerably more complex than the previous evening's elegant facade had suggested. The restoration, while undeniably magnificent, had required resources that stretched even Destry's considerable wealth, creating patterns of dependence that bound the artistic personnel to their patron, with ties far beyond conventional business relationships. A kettle sang softly on a small electric ring, its low note absorbed by heavy curtains that shut out the corridor's distant murmur of activity. Peregrine J. entered with the careful composure of someone who had spent considerable time preparing for this encounter. His usual directorial confidence seemed tempered by wariness, and when he accepted the offered chair, his movements carried the slight stiffness of suppressed tension. The morning light revealed lines of strain around his eyes that stage lighting had previously concealed. "Mr. J," Alleyn began with characteristic courtesy, "I wonder if you might elaborate on the artistic arrangements between yourself and Mr. Destry. Our examination of correspondence suggests certain complexities." J's response came after a pause weighted with careful consideration. "Mr. Destry possessed decided opinions about artistic matters, Inspector, and was not particularly receptive to alternative viewpoints. His suggestions often carried the weight of ultimatums, veiled in the most charming phrases. One felt rather like a marionette, whose strings, however silken, remained unmistakably present. In what specific ways did these expectations manifest themselves? He insisted upon approval of all casting decisions, script modifications, even matters of staging that one might consider purely technical. When his preferences were not implemented to his satisfaction, he had ways of expressing displeasure that were both subtle and remarkably effective. Jay's voice carried the measured tone of someone who had learned to navigate treacherous waters with diplomatic precision. Miranda Troy's arrival interrupted their conversation, her morning dress impeccably chosen, yet somehow defensive in its very perfection. She moved through the room with controlled grace, though Alleyn noted how her eyes avoided the theatrical portraits as if they're painted. Gazes held uncomfortable recognition. Mr. Destry was most attentive to the careers of those he supported, she said when invited to discuss their relationship, her voice carrying undertones that suggested meanings beyond surface courtesy. His interest in one's professional development was quite comprehensive, extending to aspects of personal conduct that some might consider rather outside the usual patron's purview. Were his attentions welcome, Miss Troy? The question hung in the air with delicate weight. Miranda's composure remained intact, yet Alleyn observed the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested carefully controlled emotion. One learns to appreciate the interest of those upon whom one's career depends, Inspector. Whether such appreciation extends to genuine welcome is perhaps a more complex matter. A sensible woman learns to deflect such attentions without causing offense, though the effort can prove rather exhausting. Marcus Knight's entrance provided a study in barely controlled desperation. The distinguished actor's morning attire was impeccable, yet his hands trembled slightly as he accepted tea, and his commanding presence seemed somehow diminished by circumstances beyond his control. "I am ruined, Inspector," Knight admitted with stark honesty. "My investments, my properties, my entire financial foundation, all lost through unfortunate speculations. This production represented my final opportunity for professional redemption. Without Mr. Destry's continued support, I face not merely artistic failure, but complete social collapse." The revelation cast new light on the previous evening's interactions, explaining the desperate edge beneath Knight's polished performance. It was during the subsequent examination of Destry's private papers that the most disturbing discovery emerged. Hidden within routine correspondence were documents revealing systematic information gathering about his associates, letters, financial records, personal details catalogued with methodical precision. Among these papers, Alleyn discovered evidence of what could only be described as refined blackmail, though couched in language so elegant that its true nature remained deniable. Threats disguised as concerns, demands presented as suggestions, and always the implicit understanding that cooperation was absolutely required for continued support. The final document was dated 3 days prior, its contents suggesting escalation beyond mere financial manipulation into territories that threatened personal integrity itself. As Alleyn examined the file's contents, Fox drew his attention to the lower compartment, where a narrow space revealed the ragged white edge that paper leaves when torn in haste. A document had been removed recently, and not by a careful hand. The little room, with its perfect order, lay under a very slight disturbance, as if something had been touched that would not easily be set right again. The prompt corner of the Dolphin Theatre occupied that shadowed realm where art and craft converged in quiet authority. Here, beneath the brass-shaded lamp that had guided countless performances through forgotten lines and missed cues, Emily Dunn presided over her domain with the measured precision of someone who understood that chaos lurked perpetually at the edges of theatrical enterprise. Her desk, worn smooth by decades of faithful service, bore the accumulated evidence of devotion. Scripts annotated in her precise hand, pencils sharpened to mathematical points, and a small electric kettle whose gentle whisper provided comfort during the long watches of rehearsal and performance. The air carried the mingled scents of India ink, old paper, and the faint sweetness of lavender sachets tucked between reference books toward off the moths that inevitably discovered such repositories of theatrical history. Inspector Alleyn approached this sanctuary with the respect due to someone whose knowledge might prove invaluable, though he suspected that extracting information from Miss Dunn would require considerable diplomatic skill. She received him with the measured courtesy of one accustomed to being consulted by her betters, yet her pale eyes held the watchful intelligence of someone who had observed human nature from the shadows for the better part of 40 years. "Inspector Alleyn," she said, her voice carrying the precise articulation of someone who had spent her professional life ensuring that words were heard clearly. "Mrs. Lazenby mentioned that you might wish to speak with me about poor Mr. Destry. A terrible business, though I confess it does not entirely surprise me." The admission hung in the air with curious weight. Alleyn settled himself in the small chair she indicated, noting how her domain was arranged with methodical precision. A brown teapot wrapped in faded wool sat beside her prompt copy, its margins an anthology of penciled cues and timings that spoke of countless performances, guided safely to their conclusions. "You were not surprised by Mr. Destry's death, Miss Dunn? That suggests considerable insight into circumstances that others found shocking." Her response came after a pause, during which she adjusted the position of her teacup with unnecessary care. "One observes much from this position, Inspector. Actors forget that the prompter exists, particularly during rehearsals when emotions run high and tongues become unguarded. Over the past months, I have witnessed conversations that suggested Mr. Destry's methods of patronage created considerable strain among the company." Mrs. Lazenby appeared with the quiet efficiency that marked her service, bearing a second cup and settling it with practiced discretion before retreating to allow their conversation to continue. The house manager's presence provided natural transition to broader discussion of the theatre's internal dynamics, and Miss Dunn seemed to gather her thoughts like a conductor preparing to address a complex score. "Mr. Destry possessed an unfortunate tendency to collect information about those he supported," she continued, her voice carrying the disapproval of someone whose own conduct was governed by stricter principles. "Personal details, financial difficulties, private indiscretions, all catalogued with the thoroughness of a natural historian studying specimens. He seemed to derive particular pleasure from demonstrating his knowledge at moments when such revelations would cause maximum discomfort." As their conversation deepened, Miss Dunn revealed the systematic nature of Destry's manipulation. She described how Peregrine Jay's artistic vision had been gradually eroded by suggestions that carried the weight of ultimatums, how Miranda Troy's resistance to personal advances had been met with subtle professional retaliation, and how Marcus Knight's desperate need had been exploited with calculated cruelty. "During the interval last evening," she said, consulting her prompt book with professional precision, "I made my customary rounds to ensure all mechanical elements functioned properly. The theatre's restoration was comprehensive, but old buildings develop habits that new fixtures cannot entirely eliminate." She paused, her finger tracing a notation in the margin. "I discovered that someone had interfered with the door mechanism leading to Mr. Destry's private box." "In what manner?" "The spring latch had been wedged with a common theatre pin, preventing proper closure. Such arrangements are sometimes necessary during performances to facilitate quick exits, but this particular door serves no such function." The modification was deliberate and recent. Her voice carried the certainty of someone who knew every detail of her domain. Alleyn's interest quickened. The discovery provided concrete evidence of premeditation, suggesting someone with intimate knowledge of the theatre's service areas and the foresight to ensure unimpeded access to the victim's location. Miss Dunn's account continued with additional observations that painted an increasingly complex picture of the evening's hidden activities. She had noted timing discrepancies. The interval had run 3 minutes over its scheduled length and had observed movements in the upper galleries. That did not correspond to normal theatre operations. Just as the second act was beginning, she said, her eyes fixed on some point beyond Alleyn's shoulder, I heard the distinctive click of the private stair latch. Twice, in fact. Once early in the interval, quick after the curtain fell, and again just as the 3-minute call sounded. The second time suggested haste, someone moving with purpose rather than leisure. Who has legitimate access to that stair? Mr. Destry, naturally. Mr. Conducis, occasionally. Mrs. Lazenby, when there are flowers to be arranged or refreshments to be served. The rest of us keep to our appointed places. She paused, her professional discretion warring with her sense of duty. Though I confess I observed a figure in the upper gallery during the interval, moving with considerable stealth from the direction of the private boxes. Not one of our regular staff, certainly, and far too furtive for a member of the audience. The elderly prompter's testimony illuminated not merely the mechanical details of the crime's execution, but the psychological landscape that had made murder seem inevitable. Her decades of observation had provided her with unique insight into the gradual erosion of relationships under Destry's systematic control. The careful cultivation of dependence followed by strategic withdrawal of favor. Yet when Alleyn pressed for her assessment of who among the suspects possessed both opportunity and motive, Miss Dunn's response carried the careful neutrality of someone who understood that knowledge, once revealed, could never be withdrawn. I have observed them all under considerable strain. Inspector, she said, her fingers resting lightly on her prompt book. Any of them might have reached the point where desperate measures seemed the only solution. Mr. Destry had a particular genius for identifying individual weaknesses and exploiting them with surgical precision. As their interview concluded, Alleyn found himself reflecting on the prompter's final observation. In this world of theatrical artifice, where performance and reality blurred with dangerous ease, someone had finally refused to play their assigned role. The question remained: which member of this carefully orchestrated company had chosen to write their own ending to Jeremy Destry's elaborate drama of control and manipulation? The prompt corner fell silent once more, its brass lamp casting steady light upon secrets that would soon demand their final revelation. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Jeremy, Destry's private study, with that peculiar quality of illumination that follows upon unwelcome discoveries. Here, removed from the theatrical splendor of the Dolphin's public spaces, the true nature of their victim's influence revealed itself in surroundings that spoke of cultivated taste and methodical purpose. Persian carpets in muted blues and golds covered polished oak floors, while the walls bore an eclectic collection that Inspector Alleyn suspected might prove more interesting under closer examination than their elegant arrangement initially suggested. A mahogany desk dominated the room with austere dignity, its leather surface unmarked by casual disorder, bearing only a silver paper knife fashioned in the form of a dolphin and ledgers, bound in blue cloth that hinted at accounts of more than one. Variety. Fox emerged from his systematic examination of the desk's contents with the measured satisfaction of someone who had discovered precisely what professional instinct had suggested might be found. The correspondence revealed patterns of acquisition that extended far beyond theatrical patronage into territories where legitimate commerce shaded imperceptibly, into activities that skirted legal propriety with considerable sophistication. Interesting reading, sir, Fox observed, his voice carrying that quality of understated concern that marked significant discoveries. Mr. Destry's business interests appear to have been considerably more diverse than his public reputation suggested. Some of these transactions would bear closer examination by experts in such matters. Conducis appeared in the doorway with that peculiar ability to materialize. Silently, that seemed characteristic of his continental breeding. His morning dress remained impeccable, his manner courteous yet somehow prepared for questions he preferred not to answer directly. "Gentlemen," he said, his accent lending formality to words that might otherwise seem casual, "I trust you will understand that certain aspects of our partnership required considerable discretion. The art world, particularly in these unsettled times, operates according to principles that outsiders might find difficult to comprehend. We are naturally interested in any activities that might have created enemies for Mr. Destry," Alleyn replied with characteristic courtesy. "Your correspondence suggests transactions of some complexity." Conductis settled himself in the indicated chair with careful grace, his gloved hands resting precisely upon his knees. Jeremy possessed an appreciation for beautiful objects that sometimes exceeded the boundaries of conventional collecting. There are items whose ownership history has been complicated by recent European events, and collectors who prefer their acquisitions to remain private matters. The admission carried implications that extended beyond mere commercial irregularity, yet it was the discovery of a concealed compartment within the desk itself that provided the most disturbing revelation. Behind a panel whose spring mechanism spoke of professional installation, Alleyn found documents that revealed the full extent of their victims' information gathering. Photographs, letters, financial records, and personal details had been catalogued with methodical precision, creating dossiers capable of destroying careers with surgical efficiency. Dr. Curtis arrived with his preliminary analysis, confirming Alleyn's suspicions about the murder weapon. Belladonna, Inspector, prepared in a concentrated solution that would have proved rapidly fatal. The compound requires both botanical knowledge and access to materials that exist primarily in specialized collections. Someone with connections to theatrical history or museum resources would be most likely to possess both the knowledge and the means. Mrs. Blore, the wardrobe mistress, provided additional evidence when summoned to examine certain materials discovered at the scene. Her practiced eye identified traces of period cosmetics and costume makes, adhesive that spoke of someone intimately familiar with theatrical artifice. "Someone has been at my Rouge this morning," she reported with the firmness of a guardian whose domain had been violated. "Not Miss Troy, she mixes her own palette. I found the lid slightly askew and the tiniest smear on the hinge. It's an old habit of mine to set things square." The revelation cast new light upon the crime's execution. This was not murder born of sudden passion, but a carefully planned elimination that required months of preparation and intimate knowledge of both victim and venue. The killer had chosen their weapon with deliberate irony, employing a substance associated with theatrical artifice to commit very real murder. As Alleyn examined the hidden documents more closely, the psychological pressure on the suspects became increasingly evident. Each file contained material capable of destroying not merely careers but entire social positions, suggesting that Destry's patronage had come with invisible chains of compromised dignity. The study seemed to hold its breath in the gathering dusk, as if the very furniture waited for secrets that had been carefully guarded to finally demand their reckoning. Somewhere among the elegant company of the Dolphin Theatre walked a killer who had transformed the tools of artistic illusion into instruments of deadly reality. Yet the question remained: which among Destry's victims had possessed both the specialized knowledge and the desperate courage necessary to turn theatrical artifice against its master? In the silence that followed these revelations, the faint sound of footsteps in the corridor beyond seemed to retreat with unusual haste, as if someone had been listening who preferred not to be discovered. The rehearsal room of the Dolphin Theatre possessed that quality of expectant emptiness that marked spaces designed for the transformation of written words into living performance. Dust motes drifted in slow spirals through pale morning light that filtered through tall windows, illuminating a scarred wooden floor marked with chalk notations where countless scenes had been set and struck. A battered upright piano stood against one wall, its yellowed keys bearing witness to decades of faithful service, while nearby a collection of mismatched chairs had been arranged in a deliberate circle around a scarred oak table. The air carried the mingled sense of rosin, floor wax, and that indefinable atmosphere of concentrated creative effort that clung to places where imagination was regularly transformed into reality. Inspector Alleyn had chosen this setting with careful deliberation, understanding that these individuals would find themselves on familiar ground, yet stripped of the protective artifice that theatrical performance ordinarily provided. He arranged the chairs with unhurried precision, ensuring clear sightlines, while Fox positioned himself near the windows with that quality of unobtrusive authority that marked their long partnership. Peregrine J. arrived first, his morning dress impeccable yet somehow defensive in its very perfection. He moved through the space with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to directing others, though his eyes betrayed the wariness of someone who suspected this particular performance might not follow his preferred script. Miranda Troy entered with controlled grace, her elegant costume chosen with the precision of someone who understood that appearances could serve as both shield and weapon. Marcus Knight completed the principal assembly, his distinguished bearing marred by lines of strain that stage makeup could no longer entirely disguise. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alleyn began with characteristic courtesy, "I have asked you to join me this morning because certain aspects of Mr. Destry's death require clarification through a more systematic examination of the evening's events. I trust you will indulge me in what may seem a theatrical exercise, but one which often proves illuminating." His methodical reconstruction began with seemingly innocent questions about timing and movement, yet each inquiry was designed to expose contradictions in previously provided accounts. When he described the discovery of the theatre pin that had been used to prevent the door latch from engaging properly, he observed the subtle reactions that passed across each face like shadows cast by stage lighting. "Mr. J," Alleyn continued pleasantly, "you spoke of Mr. Destry's artistic guidance. Did these suggestions ever extend beyond purely creative matters, into areas you might consider more personal in nature?" Jay's response came after a pause, weighted with careful consideration. Mr. Destry possessed decided opinions about all aspects of the theatre's operation, Inspector, including the personal lives of those he supported. He made it quite clear that my engagement to Miss Eleanor Vance might prove detrimental to what he termed the artistic integrity of our productions. His guidance in such matters carried the unmistakable weight of ultimatum. The admission hung in the air with curious gravity. Alleyn turned his attention to Miranda Troy, whose carefully maintained composure showed the first signs of strain under sustained observation. "Miss Troy, you mentioned that Mr. Destry's patronage sometimes exceeded professional boundaries. Might you elaborate on the specific nature of these difficulties?" Her mask slipped almost imperceptibly before reasserting itself with professional discipline. "Mr. Destry possessed an unfortunate tendency to confuse patronage with proprietorship, Inspector. His support came with expectations that extended far beyond artistic excellence. When such expectations were not met to his satisfaction, he had ways of expressing displeasure that were both subtle and remarkably effective. These expectations were successfully resisted. One learns to deflect such attentions without causing offense, though the effort proves rather exhausting over time. Mr. Destry was not a man who accepted deflection gracefully. Her voice carried undertones of controlled anger that suggested depths of resentment carefully concealed beneath professional necessity. Marcus Knight's facade cracked more dramatically when confronted with evidence of his desperate circumstances. "I am utterly ruined, Inspector," he admitted with the stark honesty of someone who had abandoned pretense. "Every investment, every property, every foundation of my financial security, all lost through unfortunate speculations. This production represented not merely professional opportunity but absolute salvation. Mr. Destry ensured that I understood the precarious nature of my position with mathematical Precision. The psychological dynamics of the group became increasingly apparent as each member realized that their individual secrets were no longer safe. The careful boundaries that had previously defined their relationships began to dissolve under the pressure of systematic examination, and the veneer of professional courtesy gradually gave way to something more honest yet infinitely more dangerous. Alleyn observed their reactions with quiet intensity, noting how each revelation created ripples of recognition among the others. The carefully constructed world of refined artistic endeavor had been revealed as a fragile edifice built upon foundations of fear and manipulation. "You will observe," he said with measured precision, that Mr. Destry possessed a particular genius for identifying individual vulnerabilities and exploiting them with surgical accuracy. "Each of you has described a pattern of control that extended far beyond conventional patronage into territories that some might consider unconscionable." As the morning light shifted through the tall windows, casting different shadows across the scarred floor, the rehearsal room seemed to hold its breath. The assembled company sat in the kind of silence that follows upon unwelcome revelations, each member acutely aware that their carefully guarded secrets had been exposed not merely to official scrutiny, but to one another. It was in this charged atmosphere that Alleyn made his final observation. "Someone among you reached the point where such systematic cruelty became unendurable. The question that remains is not whether Mr. Destry deserved his fate, but which particular pressure finally transformed desperation into deadly action." The silence that followed carried the weight of truth finally acknowledged. While outside the narrow windows, London continued its daily business, oblivious to the human drama that was approaching its inevitable conclusion within the restored walls of the Dolphin Theatre. The Dolphin Theatre's auditorium possessed that quality of expectant hush that marks spaces temporarily emptied of their purpose, yet somehow still vibrating with the echoes of recent performance. Afternoon light filtered through tall Georgian windows, casting long shadows across burgundy velvet seats that ascended in perfect rows toward boxes that hung like dark apertures in the gilded walls. The stage itself lay bare save for a single work light that threw harsh illumination across boards worn smooth by countless entrances and exits, while dust motes drifted in lazy spirals through shafts of golden light. The air carried that peculiar stillness, known only to theaters between performances, when the building itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of whatever drama might next unfold within its carefully preserved walls. Inspector Alleyn had chosen this setting with deliberate precision, understanding that these individuals would find themselves simultaneously on familiar ground, yet stripped of the protective artifice that theatrical performance ordinarily provided. He stood at center stage with unhurried authority, his bearing carrying that quality of quiet command that marked both accomplished actors and skilled investigators. Fox positioned himself in the wings with characteristic discretion, while the assembled suspects occupied the front rows like an audience, reluctantly attending a performance they suspected might not conclude to their satisfaction. Peregrine, Jay sat with the rigid composure of someone enduring a particularly challenging rehearsal, his hands clasped with unusual tension. Miranda Troy maintained her professional poise, though her eyes avoided direct contact with the empty boxes, while Marcus Knight's distinguished bearing seemed increasingly fragile under the weight of accumulated strain. Mrs. Lazenby had arranged additional seating with meticulous attention to protocol, her usual efficiency somehow strained by circumstances that no amount of professional experience could render routine. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alleyn began with characteristic courtesy, his voice carrying easily through the acoustically perfect space, "we gather this afternoon to examine the events that transformed what should have been an evening of artistic triumph into something far more sinister. The investigation has revealed a crime of considerable sophistication, one that required not merely opportunity and motive, but intimate knowledge of both theatrical traditions and the specific vulnerabilities of the intended victim. His methodical reconstruction began with the weapon itself, that exotic compound historically employed in period productions, yet lethal in concentrated doses. The belladonna required both botanical knowledge and access to specialized materials, pointing towards someone with connections to theatrical collections or museum resources. Dr. Curtis had confirmed that the preparation demanded considerable expertise, suggesting someone whose familiarity with such compounds extended beyond casual acquaintance. The method of administration was equally revealing, Alleyn continued, his manner remaining conversational despite the gravity of his subject. Mr. Destry's refreshments were prepared with meticulous care, the poison introduced through his private flask in a manner designed to mimic the symptoms of natural causes. This required precise knowledge of his habits, access to his personal effects, and the ability to move through the theater's service areas without attracting attention. As he spoke, Alleyn moved with deliberate grace across the stage, his gestures encompassing the empty auditorium as if it were populated by the ghosts of opening night. The timing of the crime proved equally significant. The killer had exploited the controlled chaos of opening night, when movement of personnel throughout the building would seem natural and unremarkable. The modification of the door, latch with a common theater pin, demonstrated premeditation and intimate familiarity with the building's mechanical systems. Miss Dunn observed a figure in the upper galleries during the crucial interval, Alleyn noted, his gaze lifting toward the private boxes. Someone moving with considerable stealth, yet whose presence would not seem entirely out of place to those accustomed to the theater's labyrinthine passages. The discovery of cosmetic traces, a minute smear on a handkerchief, disturbance in Mrs. Bloor's rouge pot, suggests someone intimately familiar with theatrical materials and perhaps even accustomed to their use. The psychological portrait of their killer emerged with increasing clarity as Alleyn's deductions narrowed the field of possibilities. Someone driven beyond endurance by Destry's systematic manipulation, yet possessed of the specialized knowledge necessary to plan and execute such an elaborate crime. The choice of weapon carried particular significance. Belladonna, historically associated with theatrical artifice, employed to eliminate someone who had himself mastered the art of manipulating appearances. "We are seeking an individual," Alleyn observed with measured precision, "who possessed not merely access and knowledge, but the theatrical expertise necessary to transform the tools of artistic illusion into instruments of deadly reality." This was not murder born of sudden passion, but the culmination of careful planning by someone who understood both the victim's weaknesses and the theater's hidden geography. The auditorium seemed to hold its breath as his deductions approached their inevitable terminus. In the gathering shadows of late afternoon, with golden light slanting through tall windows, the Dolphin Theatre prepared to witness the conclusion of a drama that had begun not with the rise of a curtain, but with the systematic destruction of human dignity beneath the weight of calculated cruelty. From somewhere in the building's upper reaches came the faint sound of a door closing, as if someone who had been listening preferred not to be discovered. The silence that followed carried the weight of truth approaching its final revelation, while the empty seats bore witness to a performance that would soon reach its inevitable and irreversible conclusion. Evening settled upon the Dolphin Theatre with the gentle insistence of a drawn curtain, its restored Georgian elegance bearing witness to a final performance far more consequential than any scripted drama. The auditorium's burgundy velvet seats ascended in perfect rows toward boxes that hung like dark apertures in gilded walls, while a single worklight cast harsh illumination across boards worn smooth by countless entrances and exits. The air carried that peculiar stillness, known only to theaters between performances, when the building itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of whatever revelation might next unfold. Within its carefully preserved walls, Inspector Alleyn had positioned himself at center stage with characteristic authority, his bearing carrying that quality of quiet command that marked both accomplished actors and skilled investigators. The assembled company occupied the front rows, like an audience reluctantly attending a performance they suspected might not conclude to their satisfaction. Fox remained in the wings with discretion, while Mrs. Lazenby sat with rigid composure. Peregrine J. folded himself beside her with precision too emphatic, and Miranda Troy chose her place with the calculation of someone who preferred to be seen rather than scrutinized. Marcus Knight took his seat with the air of a man prepared for an entrance not of his choosing, while in the shadows near the prompt corner, Miss Dunn waited with the patient stillness that had marked her 4 decades of faithful service. "We have examined the means by which Mr. Destry died," Alleyn began, his voice carrying easily through the acoustically perfect space. "Belladonna, concentrated and cleanly administered, whose properties are well understood in certain antiquated theatrical practices. We found a door latch propped with a common theatre pin, traces of cosmetic materials, and evidence of someone intimately familiar with both the building's hidden geography and the victim's precise habits." He moved with deliberate grace toward the prompt corner, where Miss Dunn's domain had provided such crucial testimony. The weapon required specialized knowledge, not merely botanical but historical. Someone familiar with treatises on period stage practices, with access to materials preserved in theatrical collections. From the shadows, he withdrew a slim volume bound in faded blue cloth, its pages marked with careful annotations. This particular text contains detailed discussions of Belladonna's preparation and effects, annotated by a hand that demonstrates not merely academic interest but practical application. The silence that followed possessed that quality of theatrical suspension that precedes the moment when all pretense must finally be abandoned. Miss Dunn remained perfectly still, her pale eyes fixed upon the stage with professional attention, yet something in her bearing suggested the subtle shift that marks when performance must give way to truth. "Miss Dunn," Alleyn continued with characteristic courtesy, "your position provided unique advantages. Access to all areas of the building, intimate knowledge of everyone's movements, and most significantly the invisibility that comes with decades of faithful service. You observed Mr. Destry's systematic destruction of those you had watched, developed their craft with such dedication. Her response came with the precise articulation that had guided countless performances through forgotten lines. Mr. Destry possessed a particular genius for identifying human weakness and exploiting it with surgical precision, Inspector. I watched him systematically destroy the confidence and dignity of individuals whose only crime was dependence upon his patronage. Yet it was a more personal betrayal that finally drove you to action," Alleyn observed gently. "The missing document from his private files concerned your nephew, did it not? The young actor whose career he destroyed through calculated malice 20 years ago. The admission, when it came, carried the weight of long-suppressed grief. Timothy was everything that theatre should nurture, talented, dedicated, possessed of that rare quality that transforms mere performance into art. Mr. Destry crushed him deliberately, systematically, until my nephew could no longer bear to remain in the profession he had loved. Timothy took his own life rather than endure further humiliation. The confession that followed revealed methodical justice, born not of sudden passion, but of careful planning. Miss Dunn had spent months preparing her instrument of retribution, using her encyclopedic knowledge of theatrical history to create a weapon that carried appropriate irony. The Belladonna had been extracted from specimens in the theatre's historical collection, prepared according to recipes she had researched with scholarly thoroughness. The execution required precise timing and intimate knowledge of Mr. Destry's Habits, she continued with professional detachment. I prepared his flask during the first act, when the chaos of performance provided natural cover. The door modification ensured unimpeded access, while my presence anywhere in the building would seem entirely natural. As Fox stepped forward with quiet authority, Miss Dunn rose with the dignity that had marked her long service. I regret only that Timothy cannot know his tormentor has finally been held accountable for the cruelty he inflicted with such calculated pleasure. The Dolphin Theatre, freed from its patron's controlling influence yet facing an uncertain future, stood as monument to both the transformative power of art and the destructive potential of unchecked authority. Justice had been served, though the true tragedy lay in the waste of human potential and the corruption of beauty by power systematically abused. In the gathering dusk, the curtain had fallen on Jeremy Destry's final performance, yet the echoes of his cruelty would linger long after the last light had been extinguished and the theatre had returned to its patient, waiting for whatever drama might next grace its restored and bloodied boards.